Hey, what's going on, AP guys? We have chapter 5 for you today, which is the last chapter in the colony before the French and Indian War, and we really begin to see the relationship between Britain and the colonies change. So let's get going with chapter 5. Mingling of races. We're going to talk about the makeup of the different colonies. We're going to start with the South, and the South is predominantly Anglo-Saxon, which means that people, their ancestors or themselves, are from Britain. And 20% of the South at this time in the early 1700s is going to be composed of Africans in the form of slaves. And I talked about in chapter 4 that journey that they took on, that slaves took on the way to get to America, and that was called the Middle Passage as part of the triangular trade. The New England colonies are going to be the least diverse due to Puritan roots. So if you're living in Massachusetts, chances are you're going to be from England and you are going to be Puritan. Remember, Puritans did not believe in religious freedom for people. They believed that you should be Puritan, and if you weren't, you would be kicked out. Two examples of that are Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. The middle colonies received the most amount of white immigrants, especially Pennsylvania. And this begs the question, why? Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, and he also believed in religious toleration, so people were going there of all religions. Why is the South not receiving a lot of white immigrants during this time? They are competing, or they would compete, with slaves for jobs. In other words, a lot of plantation owners were buying slaves, and whites did not want to go there because there were not a lot of jobs. Let's talk about workday America. There's a very slow growing British population, and this leads to colonists to look elsewhere to sell their goods, other countries that they're going to look to. And by 1775, most of the tobacco is being sold to France and other European countries. This goes against the idea of mercantilism, and we need to understand how or why. Now, mercantilism is the belief that the colonies, in this case the American colonies, exist for the benefit of the mother country or Great Britain. Mercantilism, mother country, mercantilism, mother country, mercantilism, mother country. So if the colonies are selling tobacco to other countries besides Great Britain, that goes against this idea of making money for the mother countries. This goes against something called the navigation laws. And this adds to conflict between the colonists and Britain. Britain is going to be very upset that the colonies are trading with other countries, and the colonies are going to get around this by smuggling. Okay, let's talk about the Great Awakening. This is going to happen in New England, and this is going to affect Puritans. More individuals during the Great Awakening convert and become active in religion again. It is a religious revival in the 1730s and the 1740s, and it is seen as the first mass social movement in American history, where you see many, many people getting involved with this on a large scale. Some causes of this are boring sermons. So people go to church, and the priest or minister would be very boring, and it would be a long service, and they would just read scripture. We also have something called Arminianism, and this directly challenged Calvinism's predestination doctrine. Remember, if you were a Calvinist, you believed in predestination, which meant that God determined whether or not you were going to heaven or hell when you die, and there was nothing you could do. It was predetermined. Under this belief, individual free will, not God, determined a person's eternal fate. So somebody who followed Arminianism said, hey, if I do good things in my life, if I'm a good person, then I will go to heaven, not because God is going to decide before my birth. And this directly challenges Puritan beliefs. Two key people you absolutely positively need to be familiar with during the First Great Awakening. First one is Jonathan Edwards. One of his grandchildren will be Aaron Burr, the man who killed Alexander Hamilton. And he is credited with starting the Great Awakening in 1734. He had a very famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Please know this. This does appear quite frequently. And in this, he said that hell was paved with the skulls of unbaptized children. So let's say that you were living in New England during this time period, and your children are not baptized, and you're not very religious, and you hear this sermon, and you hear this idea that your children will be in hell when they die because they've not been baptized. This causes many people to flock to churches and have their children baptized, and they become church members. The other guy who plays a very important role is George Whitefield. And he used an electrifying new style of preaching. He was screaming, he was walking around, he was jumping up and down. He played off of people's emotions. And this is something similar that happens in the Second Great Awakening. But he really, really is a great orator. and many people were saved during his sermons. In other words, many people converted. Okay, we really need to know the effects of the First Great Awakening. We have two groups that emerge, one that was already around, but it gets a name of Old Lights versus New Lights. And the New Lights would be your John Edwards and George Whitefields, these new preachers, these new ministers who are putting emotion into their sermons. And new light centers, new universities pop up, such as Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. And these colleges, the purpose of these colleges in the beginning was to train ministers. We have increasing competitiveness of churches. There are new churches that are being born, and this is a strong democratic component because people have a choice with religion. There are more branches of Christianity that are popping up, and people can decide, I want to go to this church instead of another one. So they have a choice in where they're going to go. So some effects that you may see, some questions and answers you may see on tests. An effect could be old light versus new light. Emotion is now more in churches, and also the religious unity declines or the amount of churches increases. And this is another important example of resistance to established authority. They are challenging some long-standing authority of churches. This will play a role in the American Revolution because people are resisting established authority. In that case, it will be Great Britain. Lastly, we'll finish up with the press during colonial times. A couple books and people you need to be familiar with. Poor Richard's Almanac was a book written by Ben Franklin, and it contains sayings from the thinkers of the age and emphasized virtues of thrift and common sense. And here is Benjamin Franklin. This, during the time, was the second best-selling book behind only one other. And do you know what that book is? The Bible. There is a newspaper editor by the name of John Peter Zenger, and he assailed or attacked a royal governor in his newspaper. That was a crime. He is put on trial, and he's charged with libel, and he's defended by this man, Alexander Hamilton, who, by the way, was a former indentured servant. And an indentured servant, again, is somebody who has their passage paid to America, and in exchange they work for a period of time, usually 5 to 7 years. Alexander Hamilton defends him, and he, John Peter Zenger, was found not guilty. And this is enormous. This decision was an achievement for freedom of the press, which we will see later in the First Amendment. And newspapers now, from John Peter Zenger going forward, were free to print responsible criticisms of powerful officials if they were true. In other words, no longer did people have to hold back about reporting the truth. If something was true about a British governor or an official, they could print it and they would not get in trouble for saying that. Okay, that's it for Chapter 5. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, please do one of two things. Either email me or leave them in the comments. I will be able to answer anything. I will explain anything more in detail. Please subscribe if you have not already. This guy did. Ben Franklin actually said, you know what's cooler than discovering electricity? Subscribing to Mr. Norris's channel for cool videos. It would have been a lot cooler if the bottom of this were coming out of his mouth, but you know what? He was just busy that day. All right, good luck on your test, especially the one in May, the APUSH exam in May. Have a good day, guys.